Good morning, everyone. All right, welcome to the Monash Global Health Technology Competition for this year. Happy New Year. Hope you guys had a great holiday. Thanks so much for coming on such a rainy day as well. So my name's Kwa, and with my TAs Netham and Deepak, we're going to be running the competition. So I'll go through the structure of it, but basically these first 3 weeks is a kickoff. And then you'll aim to have a submission by mid-February. And so just because you've already started uni by then, we're going to sort of have like less, regular touch bases rather than like a complete program. So a little bit about myself. So Kwa, sort of like koala, the first syllable of that. I studied med at Monash, and then during my time at med, I actually interned at the World Health Organization. So that is an option available to you if you so choose. I think the only criteria that you sort of need to meet in order to intern at the WHO is you need to be 21 plus. So they just have like a minimum age of 21. Once you're above 21, you can actually reach out to different supervisors at the World Health Organization. They're usually pretty chill. The only caveat is you unfortunately don't get paid. So United Nations has this weird policy, although it might have changed since 2016 where they don't pay their interns. But there was like a giant political push when I was there to try and pay the interns, so maybe it's actually improved. So really cool sort of thing. I came back really inspired, decided to do a malaria AI startup in my BMed Sci year. That sort of didn't get anywhere, but it's a really fun journey. But we actually did create a software that could diagnose malaria really well. I then was sort of inspired again by all that and did a Masters of Public Health in London. So one of the top universities for public health is the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. You may actually interface with some of these people throughout your journey during this competition. But they're sort of a university based in the UK. They have really deep ties to lots of different countries around the world just because of the UK's sort of colonial history, right? And so they're really connected into lots of different countries. They also do a lot of public health work, and so they sort of have a lot of experience across all sorts of stuff, which we'll go through, during this competition. Came back, became a doctor at the Austin. Decided that doctoring full-time wasn't really for me, so then I decided to study engineering at Stanford University in the United States, in California, where I got to do all sorts of cool stuff like build devices, learn how to code, and also do something called global by-design, which is a clinical innovation methodology that you're going to get really used to over the next few weeks in a global health context. I then did a very Stanford-y thing, did a neurotech startup in the Bay Area. That was a really wild ride, got like VC funding, failed, and then joined the Monash medical faculty and the engineering faculties as an associate professor of engineering and medicine. And yeah, this is my World Health Organization badge back when I was a medical student. But yeah, really fun. Actually a surprising number of Australian medical students there, so it's actually a much more common journey than you might expect, so really cool. And feel free to speak to me if you're sort of interested in that journey. All right, Nathan?
Hey guys, my name's Nathan. As you can see, I'm a final year medical student. So kind of going through third and fourth year, I kind of realized that I didn't really love clinical medicine, and so I decided to kind of explore other avenues, in particular engineering. So that led me to do a BMed Sci last year at a cardiovascular engineering lab at the Victorian Heart Hospital. In that I was basically designing and manufacturing an aortic phantom, which is a model of the aorta. In that I had to teach myself like CAD design, 3D printing, silicon molding, and I really enjoyed that. And then I also had the opportunity to attend all of Kwa's workshops throughout last year, and so I got to build up a lot of new skills, as well, like continuing 3D printing as well as in software, doing coding, and medical AI. And so I've really found that I've really enjoyed the space of engineering, and so that's something I hope to go into in the future, and I really enjoy hardware specifically, and hopefully I can help you guys learn a bit about that as well.
Awesome. Deepak?
Hey everyone, finally a medical student too. I did my honours year last year now at CIRA, the Centre for Eye Research Australia, in AI and ophthalmology. My goal was really to learn about AI. We did MedHack as well last year, finalist. Funnily enough, Kwa made MedHack. So I found that out later, which is kind of funny. And then there's a whole bunch of Stanford computer science courses that are available publicly. So talk to me if you guys want more info on that. And then I did a little bit of teaching at the last AI bootcamp that we had. And there's a lot of cool little projects that are now opportunities that people can do that have never been able to do with AI. So for example, placement learning experience sucks right now. There's just so little feedback we get for all of like the patients we try to see and try to work up. And improving placement learning is like a very high yield thing, I think, that I'm excited to like continue to work on. And then also I started blogging and doing stuff on Twitter. So I think for myself, a big part of that was trying to learn what I was interested in. So I think synthesizing your thoughts and doing research to share useful insights automatically teaches you two things, which is like how to talk to people and like get interested in cool conversations that you actually love. And also in doing so, you learn what you love. And in doing so, you build connections with people who are doing what you love too. So yeah, talk to me about blogging, talk to me about like social media presence. I think it's pretty important, especially if you want to like explore other stuff, meta-adjacent.
Cool. All right, thanks, Deepak. Okay, so I direct the Monash Medical Technology Lab, and we have 3 goals. So the first is to contribute to key research for medical AI. So we just ran a whole medical AI bootcamp for 5 weeks after your exams, but before Christmas. So we're sort of still a little bit hungover from that. The second is to train the next generation of medical technology leaders, and that's this program is part of that aim. So that's you guys, right? And then the third is to empower doctors and medical students to become stronger innovators with biodesign, and this is also part of that as well. So we'll be going through biodesign, which is sort of like a hot new methodology that all the Australian universities are getting into now, but has been sort of really a successful play from Stanford University's perspective in order to sort of get more doctors innovating. Okay, so a lot of people ask me, why medtech? Why did you switch from sort of clinical medicine to medtech? And I usually break this up into 2 questions. The first is, why do I like medtech? And the second is, why is medtech important? So why do I like medtech? So there's sort of 3 reasons why. The first is building and inventing is really fulfilling. So hopefully you get a taste of that in the next 3 weeks, which is to actually build something, invent something, and create positive change. What you build can have massive impact. So when you create a new technology, it's something that can sort of be inserted into millions of clinical situations around the world. What you'll sort of be creating might be less than that in this competition, just because we're going to be focusing on specific communities in global health, right? But what you sort of create can always have impact for lasting generations, right? And so you sort of have to keep that in mind as you're getting through, building is really tough sometimes, have the end goal in mind when you're trying to build. The third is that creativity and curiosity is really strongly rewarded, right? So clinical medicine has become a little bit of, a memory game in some respects, right? And so when you're creating something and building something with engineering, having that creativity is really critical in order to actually get the next insight or to build something that's better than what others have built. Why is medtech important? So it is one of the few levers that we have to actually improve medicine. The other 2 being pretty much like policy or public health, as well as research, right? So medtech actually shifts, what we're using in clinical practice, forward, right? And so building medtech is actually one of the few ways you can, as a doctor, leverage your medical degree to be improving the world. Society does need doctors to invent, so we obviously need a lot more doctors, instead of just sort of being a cog in the wheel, to actually being, something that improves the cogs, right? Like the system that we're operating in. And so medtech actually allows you and enables you to actually leverage some of that clinical information you have in order to be sort of improving how we're dealing with medicine. And finally, this is more of a sort of personal mission, but I do believe that future generations deserve a lot better than what we have now, right? And this sort of ties into the global health angle, but current generations also deserve, better than what they have now, particularly in low income settings. All right, so what is medtech? So just to sort of set the scene in terms of how you're thinking about different solutions, there are basically 3 disciplines to medtech. The first being digital health and medical AI, the second being medical devices, and then the third being drugs and biotechnology, right? And we'll sort of go through what each of those mean. But we'll be playing around primarily in the first 2 disciplines just because we don't have access to a lab, right? Like a lab that allows you to develop drugs or biotechnology. Also, from a practical standpoint, drugs and biotechnology does take like 10 to 20 years to develop properly, right? And so unless you're sort of in it for the long haul, it's quite challenging to get you to develop drugs in this course. That being said, we'll sort of focus again on the first 2, which are already very powerful levers from an engineering perspective. Now, digital health and medical AI, I'm sure you sort of heard about everything that's happening. We just taught a course on medical AI about it, and you're always welcome to access all the stuff that we've taught previously. So we sort of have a policy in the lab to be publishing everything we teach and sort of sharing it with the world. These are some recent articles that we've been discussing, particularly in our course, which is large language models. There was this randomized controlled trial where they tested AI by itself against doctors with AI, and the AI actually did better, right? And so a lot of these studies have started to come up now, and as a field, I don't think we've sort of realized what that actually means for our field, right? Some of the conclusions of this paper in particular, and this is not in in some crappy journal, it was in JAMA, right? Basically, we're discussing, the doctors actually didn't know how to use the AI well. They were using it very much like a search engine, right? They were using it like Google, they didn't paste the whole case in. But if, for example, you could train doctors to paste the whole case in, trust the signals that the AI is given, perhaps doctors plus AI could do better, right? We don't know. But at the same time, what does that mean for our field? Over the Christmas break, there was a release of a model called OpenAI, or not a release, but rather sort of a news release about a model called OpenAI O3. And it's been a model that has sort of blown us all away just because it has figured out how to generalize very challenging tasks in a way that we didn't expect, and in a way that's a lot faster than what we sort of anticipated with earlier what's called reasoning models. And so this sort of O3 thing is sort of leading to a lot of people to speculate that we might get AGI, or artificial general intelligence, sometime this year or next year. So don't know, but we're making huge strides towards having sort of intelligence that is quite powerful, at least from an AI perspective. And so what does that mean for global health? What does that mean for even healthcare here? We still don't understand yet, because just sort of that thinking capacity, might be something that's just very replicable, right? You can just sort of copy and paste a thinking doctor. You can't do that with a surgeon yet, right? Like a surgeon who has to physically do a task. We're sort of not there from a robotics perspective yet. But someone who's just sort of a thinking machine, which honestly is a physician, what does that mean if you can sort of just copy and paste them at scale, right? Without sort of any additional cost, right? So we don't understand that, again, as a medical community. All right, medical devices. So there's been a whole sort of heap of devices that have been invented in the last few years, which have been very exciting. Things from glucose monitors to the evolution of pacemakers. So this is pacemakers sort of in the 90s or early 2000s, and this is actually what the pacemakers now look like, right? So they're called leadless pacemakers. Again, we sort of started to miniaturize a lot of devices, right? What does that mean for safety? What does that mean for efficacy? Does anyone know what this is? Some of you may have already seen these slides, but does anyone actually know what that is there? No? Okay, has anyone ever seen an MRI machine? They're huge, right? They could probably take up like at least half this room. That's actually an MRI machine, right? So MRI machines have started to get sort of miniaturized. They're using sort of all these cool signal processing techniques, right? In order to basically shrink how much magnetic field strength you actually need, right? So these operate on a magnetic field strength which is about 100 times less than a standard MRI. And so because of that, you can sort of use a much smaller machine. You can actually push it around the hospital, right? And so you don't need to sort of bring the patient to the MRI anymore. It's rather you bring the MRI to the patient, right? So these sort of progresses are happening. And so, what does this mean for global health as well? A big question. Now, drugs and biotechnology, we won't spend much time on. A lot of positive impact from a global health perspective comes from drugs and biotechnology, as we're well aware, right? Things like malaria vaccines or HIV drugs, that sort of thing, they make huge, huge impact, right? But at the same time, these take years and years to develop just because there's so much clinical rigor in terms of assessing these drugs, right? And so we won't really be operating it, but you will see solutions that have succeeded from a drugs and biotechnology standpoint. But you do also need billions of dollars, right? So these are sort of billion-dollar or trillion-dollar companies which are operating in this space. Recent sort of developments that we've seen is obviously Ozempic, things like genetic editing. There was the FDA recently approved a therapy for sickle cell therapy, so it's the first genetic therapy that was approved. Things like cancer sort of related stuff. So cancer is a huge issue in low-income countries. We always think about it as sort of like a rich country problem. But everyone gets cancer, right? And there are practically no treatments in a lot of countries, right? And so it's not just sort of high income countries. And then there's, if you have some spare time, read up about this technology, right? This is sort of like the successor to IVF, but to an insane degree, which is they take, for example, a skin cell from any human, they turn that into an egg or a sperm, and then you can basically create fertilization using that, right? So just think about that. That means that I can take a skin cell, for example, from a male and then make an egg, right? Or I can take a skin cell from a female and then make a sperm, and then create a human embryo, right? You can also theoretically make a baby with yourself because you just take 2 skin cells from yourself, right? So what does that mean? Do you just make a clone of yourself? I don't know, right? So again, this technology is already starting to be developed by some startups. So again, it's just something to think about. What does that mean for society? All right, now, one of the things that we sort of rarely talk about is the different contexts in which we operate in, right? So we talk about the different types of technologies, but different types of technologies have different contexts that they operate in, right? And one of the ways that you can sort of split up the different contexts is depending on the income of the countries that we've talked about. So have you guys heard of this structure before, sort of high, middle, and low income countries? Yes? No? Okay, so hopefully you have. So it's sort of a terminology we've been using since 1987. Before that, you might have heard things like, first world countries, second world countries, third world countries. That terminology has fallen a little bit out of favor, right? So right now, this is actually the formal terminology we use. And so these are the high income countries that we have. And they're sort of your usual culprits, right? So obviously Australia, big surprise, is a high income country. Things like Canada and the United States, a lot of European countries, particularly Western European countries and the Scandinavians, right? Some countries here in the Middle East are quite high income, South Korea and Japan, and then some countries in South America as well, okay? And so we sort of tend to think a little bit as a blob, but there are countries, for example, in South America which are quite wealthy, right? And so they can afford quite a lot of the, standard healthcare that you might see in other countries as well. These are the middle income countries. So this is a huge sort of group of countries, right? So countries that honestly we just log together as middle income. The middle income countries themselves are split into high and low middle income countries, okay? So LMICs and HMICs. So as you enter global health, there's just a bunch of acronyms you need to learn that a lot of people end up using, right? And so just learning the language of it is already, already sort of part of the battle. But as you can see, it's a giant swathe of South America, right? It's a giant swathe of Africa that's outside of sub-Saharan Africa, okay? A giant swathe of Asian countries, okay? And then so that's sort of what we consider to be middle income countries. And then the low income countries are this list here, and they are primarily sub-Saharan African countries, right? With a few sort of countries floating around the Eurasias. But yeah, that's sort of what low income countries, and we'll talk about probably later in the week why they are still low income countries, right? So there's been sort of lots of studies on why low income countries initially defined in 1987 are still low income countries today, right? Because, and I think it's on this, no, it's in a few slides, but there's basically graphs showing that the GDP per capita of low income countries has stayed very much the same relative to the rest of the world, right? And there's lots of sort of reasons or theories as to why that is the case. And I think, honestly, it differs per country, right? To be honest, right? And so we'll sort of break into that just because you need to be aware of those factors as you're designing solutions. Now, healthcare in high income countries, we're familiar with this. Very robust healthcare infrastructure, right? So from a medical, device standpoint or medical AI standpoint or whatever, you have the ability to actually deploy solutions. So just for example, if I'm building a medical AI software, which we do in our lab, right? Just the fact that we can actually deploy the software in a hospital is huge, right? Because if you, for example, go to a low-income country, they don't even have a health record, right? Like they don't even have a way to actually deploy your solution, right? They don't have servers on site. They don't have software engineers on site who can actually build your software and actually integrate it in, right? Things like maintenance. So, if you have some sort of device that you need to deploy in a hospital, there are engineers on site who will actually maintain your device for you, right? Like that is huge. That is not something you can also take for granted in low-income settings. Things like supply chain. So the supply chain, in Australia, sometimes there's sort of like things on the news, which is like, we ran out of this drug or that drug, right? But that happens a lot more in low-income countries, right? Our supply chain is relatively robust. It's not perfect, right? No supply chain is, but you can sort of be sure that if you order a drug, it's going to be there, right? It's going to sort of be there and it's going to sort of arrive. Even basic things like electricity, okay? So we sort of have a good electricity supply, right? So you can be sure that the hospital isn't just going to run out of electricity, right? And then sort of need to go into emergency mode. We have well-trained clinicians and engineers, so obviously, that's you guys, right? So the medical schooling that you receive is decent, right? The engineering, stuff that you receive if you're an engineer is quite decent at Monash, right? And we also have strong reimbursement frameworks. So this is typically universal healthcare, obviously with the exception of the United States, right? But there is enough money sloshing around, right, that you can pay for most goods, right? You might not be able to pay for the most expensive drugs, right? Like if it's like $1 million per person, but you are able to pay for most devices and most drugs. Now in middle income countries, and can I get a show of hands if you're sort of familiar with a middle income country in some way? Have you ever actually been in a hospital in a middle income country before? Okay, just a few of you, okay. So this is sort of what the scene looks like, right? And this is an image from a country that I know fairly well, which is Vietnam, right? So I'm sort of like a Vietnamese immigrant. So in Vietnam, there's uneven healthcare infrastructure, right? So it's often excellent in cities. So what you'll see is that in the sort of bigger cities, you get healthcare that is honestly quite equivalent to Australia, right? Like it's decent doctors, decent equipment, decent surgeries, everything's quite good. But then things, in rural regions, there are huge gaps, okay? You sort of never wish that you get appendicitis in a rural region or you get some sort of serious medical emergency in a rural region because their healthcare system is very poor, right? And so it's very uneven, and it's a little bit of where you sort of reside and where you live and where you're sort of floating around when you get a health issue. That sort of dictates what healthcare you get. Now you can also look at that and go, Australia sort of has that. You don't want to get like, appendicitis in Mildura or something, right? But at the same time, the level of care that you get is sufficient, right? It's much better than sort of the quality of care you might get sort of in rural Vietnam or rural India or whatever it is. Okay, there's usually variable clinical engineering quality, so it follows a similar pattern. Again, in the cities, usually quite excellent, right? Because the universities, students in universities in the cities, they get good education, they sort of get good practice on what they're doing, right? In rural areas, again, very poor or lacking or missing, right? And a sort of concern that's starting to come up is brain drain, right? Where, if you're, say, a well-trained orthopedic surgeon in a middle-income country, you could earn 10 times more in a high-income country, right? And so would you take that deal if it was your family, right? So a lot of people do, right? And reasonably so. And so brain drain is a major concern. And in middle-income countries, generally there's very diverse funding sources, but for most devices, most software, they do cover it, right? Sort of most of the basics. They're not gonna have sort of like every fancy thing, right? Sometimes they do in the cities, particularly for private centers, but the sort of funding sources that you'll see is, a mixture of public, private, out-of-pocket, and international aid, okay? And so those are the four main sources that you'll see just floating around, and we'll talk about health economics later in the week and how health systems are actually funded later in the week, because you really need to understand it to operate in this space. But because we have, again, it's a huge group of countries, right? It's like 100 countries or something. Different countries will have different mixes in completely different contexts, right? Depending on the condition you're talking about, the area you're talking about, the region you're talking about. And so you sort of need to always ask, what mix of this currently exists in my region, okay? The region I'm operating in. How much of this, right? Because it completely impacts the incentives you need to have in place in order to get adoption, okay? Now, for this competition in particular, we're gonna get you to focus on LMIC or lower, okay? So you have to choose a country that is low middle income country or low income country, okay? And this is the list of LMICs, so you can take a look at this list and sort of familiarize yourself with it. Okay, and you can access it later. So low income countries. So unfortunately, this is sort of the lowest of income, lowest of healthcare that you're gonna find around the world. So generally they'll have unreliable healthcare infrastructure. So hospitals and clinics will be very overcrowded. There's gonna be often poor electricity in lots of contexts, right? Not every context, but a lot of contexts, right? There's going to be issues with water, so lots of devices rely on things like just access to water. So for example, a dialysis machine, right? So if you don't have, reliable access to clean water, then water becomes a huge issue. There's often supply chain issues, so things running out. So they're very adaptable, right? Like they have to adapt to the fact that this drug might not be available, or this test might not be available at this time, or this procedure might not be available, right? And so supply chain is sort of a big consideration. There's generally a shortage of well-trained engineers and clinicians, right? I was talking about 10x from middle income country to high income country. It looks like 100x if you're well-trained, right? And so at the World Health Organization, I worked in the ophthalmology department, right? And there was this huge issue of ophthalmologists being very well-trained in low-income countries and deciding to take like 100x salary in a high-income country, right? Would you do it? Again, if it's your family, right? Of course you would, right? 100x. Unfortunately, the population is also usually less literate, and they're also less health literate as well, right? So you'll see sort of as you move through med school, a lot of people like to operate in sort of better health literate suburbs in Melbourne, right? Just because it's so much less work for them, right? And so if you think about it, sort of that literature, like where they don't understand, what kind of health issues might come up, or they might believe something sort of a bit like culturally, more appropriate, right? Like that is sort of a huge burden because you need to sort of design your device around that as well, right? And sort of think about those factors. Funding presents a major challenge, right? So when I sort of had my first sojourn into this space, funding is a huge sort of issue that you have to deal with and sort of almost deal directly head on, because if you don't and avoid it, then you'll never get funding for your project, right? And typically how funding occurs is through non-government organizations and donors. And part of the issue is that they have a lot of money floating around, but they have very specific priorities, right? And if you don't fit within their priorities, you're not going to get any funding whatsoever, right? And unfortunately, their fundings are dynamic as well. Their priorities are dynamic as well, meaning that it changes constantly, right? And so they could be very interested in this specific problem. Because it takes a few years to develop a device, by the time you develop the device, the priorities have shifted and your project just simply dies. Okay, and so this is a very sort of serious issue in this space. Just because they have so much power, these sort of organizations here have a giant amount of sway in terms of what projects get funded and what projects don't get funded, okay? And so you're gonna run into these issues time and time again. Later this week, we're actually gonna spend some time discussing the different organizations which are playing in this space, right? And for you to sort of understand what their missions are, what their priorities are, what kind of projects they actually fund. Because in order to sort of do well in this competition, and if you're interested actually create a product, right, you need to really align yourself with the priorities of the donor, right? And if you sort of fail to do so, you're never going to get a project off the ground. All right, now we're going to talk again about this later in the week, but sort of an idea of the economics and the sort of forces behind low-income countries. So why do low-income countries stay low-income? And there's lots of actually different theories from different economists, right? But these are some of the theories, right? So a leading theory that actually just won the Nobel Prize last year is that it's a failure of institutions, right? So they argue that this is, I think, Acemoglu, and can't remember the other gentleman's name, but they argue that it's a failure of these things, which is property rights, so the ability to actually own what you own, right? And no one's going to take it away from you, so that's property rights. A failure of legal systems and a failure of political stability. Okay, so that's what they argue is one of the causes, of why low-income countries stay low-income, and it's from failed institutions. Okay. The second argument that is quite common is what's called endogenous growth, which is it's a lack of human capital, it's a lack of innovation, it's a lack of knowledge, right? And so there's that sort of brain drain that happens, from a lot of low-income countries, and so the best and brightest sort of leave for it, and therefore the country just sort of always remains in this sort of cycle of no innovation and no creation and no knowledge. The third is the resource curse. So some countries, and I believe this only applies to some countries, but essentially they argue that if there is a huge amount of natural resources available, there's eventually someone who's going to go into power and then eventually rent seek. And what rent seeking means is that they basically stay in power and just sort of take 90% of the economy, and make sure that sort of no one else can expand the economy, right? And so that rent-seeking behavior does occur in some countries with high levels of natural resources, okay? So an example of that is, for example, Venezuela is a classic example where they have, I think most of the world's oil, is in Venezuela or something. But because of that, the government's very interested in basically keeping most of that oil revenue for themselves and sort of preventing others from growing their wealth as well. Okay, so that's the resource curse. Path dependency is another theory, which is historical events have shaped the country to head towards this trajectory, and it's very difficult to leave that trajectory, right? So a classic example of that is, Russia, right? The birth of communism was there, and so it's very hard for them to sort of leave that communist track, right? Just because of inertia, right? So that's path dependency. And then finally, some countries, are unfortunately landlocked or sort of subject to natural disasters, and so that keeps their country very poor just because they're trying to solve the natural disasters constantly, right? Or react to those. And a sort of classic example of that is Nepal, which is very landlocked and very subject to natural disasters. And so some people think that it's sort of remained, it's actually not a low-income country anymore, but it's a LMIC, but it's sort of remained poor because of that, right? Because it doesn't seem to suffer as much from the other issues, okay? All right. Now, this is sort of a quote that I, from Leo Tolstoy that I sort of think about when I see this, which is, happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And so I actually do look at these theories and sort of think, each country has its own issues that it needs to resolve, right? So it's not sort of this one theory is the dominating, theory for why low-income countries stay low-income. And low-income countries are very heterogeneous, right? Some countries might have issues in this case, some countries might have issues with other reasons. Now this is the graph that I was talking about here. So 1987 was when this classification was created, and as you can see, low-income countries honestly have just stayed pretty much at the same GDP per capita, right? Does anyone know what GDP per capita means? Is that okay? Yep. Yeah, per person, exactly. So it's just the size of the market, basically, that this country has, right? That's obviously a hand-wavy definition, and then you divide it by the number of people, right? And so, obviously, if you are a wealthy country, then you're gonna have a much higher GDP per capita, right? And if you're a relatively low-income country, then you're gonna have a very low GDP per capita. And so, as you can see here, sort of it's remained the same. These are the countries here which have escaped to lower middle income, right? These are the countries which have somehow escaped to upper middle or high income, right? And this is the world average. So the world itself is getting richer, right? But these low-income countries are remaining the same level of wealth, right? Which is absolutely sort of mind-blowing if you think about it, because it's been 30 years since this has been developed, and we sort of almost had no progress whatsoever for these low-income countries. All right, so let's switch tack to the design competition itself. So this is a design competition from Rice University in the United States, which is a leading global health center in the United States. You may or may not have heard of it before, but it's a university in Texas. And so the design competition is inspired sort of for undergraduate students from around the world to design low-cost tech for global health challenges in resource-limited settings, okay? And so how we've interpreted that is you need to be designing for a community in at least an LMIC or an LIC, okay? So you sort of avoid high-income countries or high middle-income countries. You must address a global health need with a technical approach, okay? So this is run by, I think, a global health and an engineering team, and so they do expect an engineering approach, right? Obviously, an engineering approach isn't always perfect, right? Because sometimes it's a systems approach you need to solve a problem, or a funding approach, or contextual approach, right? Like, for example, just if the war just stopped, right, everyone would improve, right? But we're fortunately just focusing on an engineering approach. You must incorporate design constraints in resource-limited settings. So there's, and we're going to talk about this sort of later in the course, but there's lots of design constraints when you're designing for a low-income country or low-middle-income country, right? There's things like electricity might run out. There's very limited money that might be floating around in that community. So you have to sort of consider all that as you're designing. So it's sort of a very challenging thing. If you're interested in reading more, this is the website, right? And you can always just search Rice 360 Design Competition, find it. And you can read more about, what they're hoping for, past entries, that sort of stuff. A design rubric that has been, very difficult for us to get. So yeah, there's all sorts of information on that website. All right, now how the sort of applications work is that by Feb 17th, which I believe is a Sunday, so you sort of should be ready by Feb 15th, you need to submit all this, okay? And again, you can look on the website, but essentially you need to describe the problem you're working on, the solution that you've created, an abstract which talks about the design problem and assessment of the unmet need, design criteria and constraints that you've considered, description and status of your proposed solution, along with successes, limitations, and future work. So you sort of need to understand where your solution's going wrong, what it's doing well, what you're going to do in future. You need to also include a project video, right? So just so that they can get to know your team, as well as a project image. So it could be a sketch or it could be an image of your invention. Now, the teams that we've seen sort of win generally have some sort of physical prototype, okay? So it's not just like an idea, right? It's not just like a sketch that you have. Generally, it does require you to actually create stuff just because physical prototyping allows you to sort of experiment with stuff that you wouldn't be able to expect, right? Like there's nothing like holding something in your hands, right? Or having a UI if it's a software, right? So something that you can actually show us and sort of demonstrate to them that you've created something. Now, if you're selected as a semi-finalist, then on April 11th, between the sort of, I think, 6 or 7 weeks, you're gonna get coaching from more global health mentors. You have to do an oral presentation, which is less than 6 minutes. That can be done remotely, and then prizes awarded. And the seed funding can be actually used to, actually fund activities that you might be interested to actually launch your product, right? Whether it's, for example, going to that community as a team, maybe not as a team, but like some members, right? Or actually building something sort of to get to the next stage. All right, design rubric, like I said, it's been a bit hard to contact Rice, I think, because they've been off, right, on holiday, but to be released. Once we get that, then we'll sort of release it to everyone. But these are the 3 things they're gonna be looking for. The first is the quality of your problem definition, so that is how well do you actually understand the problem you're working on, okay? Unfortunately, I'm gonna spend some time on that in the course. The effectiveness and potential impact of your solution, and then the likelihood that your solution is actually gonna be successful. Okay? So problem, solution, and likelihood that it'll be successful. Okay, very simple. All right, there's also other awards just to be aware of, right? So if you're, for example, deciding on something that's digital health or material science related, they provide a cash reward for the best innovation in that. DAI award, which is it considers, your project considers a marginalized population. So if your project happens to, focus on a marginalized population, then you're eligible for this award. There's an open source award, which is the best fully open source project. The incremental improvement award, which is you improve a prior project, right? Either from a past team or something that already exists in the public space. And then the People's Choice Award, which is a voting thing. All right, so our goals of this course sort of go beyond the competition itself, right? So we want to provide you a strong foundation to actually build tech for global health, right? So it doesn't matter if you win or lose the competition, we hope for you to leave this, this course with skills that are transferable to sort of other contexts in global health. We hope to kickstart a global health tech project for Rice 360. Now a month or 2 months isn't very much time, honestly, to create a device, right? It's gonna be sort of like a fun time, but to be able to actually do something for real, it does take you a year or 2 years or 3 years, right? And so we're sort of there to support you, particularly if it's a project that you're very sort of inspired by and you sort of really want to continue working on. And then finally, we want to prepare you for roles in global health tech, right? There's not enough doctors sort of in the world who are working in this space, and we hope that at least some of you might be sort of inspired to work within global health tech. All right, so what do the weeks look like? So during week 1, which is this week, we're gonna focus on a process called needs generation, okay? Which basically will see you generate hundreds of unmet clinical needs, and we'll go through how to do that effectively, why you should be doing that. But essentially what we're gonna cover is, unmet clinical needs itself, the global health focus areas. So this afternoon we'll be talking about different global health focus areas, the needs generation process, systems and contextual approaches. So we're gonna actually share a bit more information about how global health actually works, right? For example, from a funding perspective, the different sort of issues that you'll find in global health. And you'll be doing some interviews, or at least setting up this week a bunch of interviews for you to speak to people on the ground, right? When you're sort of solving a problem with, for a community, you never do it sort of apart from them, right? You need to be in contact with them. You need to have a clinician on the ground who actually understands the issues that you're trying to deal with, right? Because they need to be sort of, the translator between what's happening on the ground and what you're creating, right? Because unfortunately we can't send you to these areas, but talking to people on Zoom or talking to people on phone or whatever it is, or on Skype, right? Will sort of be a big help in terms of figuring out what problems you want to solve and what solutions you want to build. So week 2 will be need selection and solution brainstorming. So by mid next week, we're going to get you to actually pick a problem you want to work on, right? So your team must pick a problem that you're going to work on. And then we're going to do solution brainstorming, right? Which is thinking of all the potential ways that you can actually solve this problem, okay? Now, what we're going to cover from a sort of technical standpoint is things like needs criteria, how to brainstorm and prototype effectively. We're going to go through some case studies of what successful global health tech actually looks like, right? And there's been only, sort of a small amount of projects, but they have a lot of sort of learning lessons in terms of figuring out how to actually deploy a project successfully. And you're going to continue your interviews, okay? So this is going to be a common theme, which is you need to be speaking to people on the ground. Week 3 will be prototyping. So this is going to be a lot more of a technical week, right? And so this is where we sort of rely on which directions you're heading in, but we're going to provide as much as we can technical workshops, right? So that you can actually build your thing. We're going to cover sort of global by design considerations. So there's things like intellectual property, regulatory strategy, reimbursement strategy, operational strategy that you need to understand, right? So we're going to cover sort of the basics of that and continue your interviews. Week 4 to 6, so this is before the February deadline. So this is the development phase. The goal will be to refine your prototype and your application for the competition. You're going to be starting uni by then, so we're going to have regular touch bases as well as sort of application development support. All right, now as scheduled, just for those who haven't attended before, generally every day it's 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. with lunch for an hour, and Wednesdays are off, okay? Just for our sanity and your sanity as well. So Wednesdays you can just book whatever you want, right? Wednesdays we don't have class, you don't have to be here. But every other day is 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. All right, so this is our course website. So there's not much on the website, but save this link just because we're going to be posting stuff on there, right? So, we're going to be posting recordings, slides, all that stuff on there. Okay, and we also have a Discord community, so take a picture of that as well, join it. We just post stuff on there, if there's any updates or any useful links, or, it's also a way for you to, chat with your team if you're remote. Okay, and that's it for the kickoff. So now we'll move to the next part, which is Intro to Biodesign. Okay, so why don't we actually take a break for 2 minutes? If you want to go to the toilet or whatever, then come back, and then we'll start our introduction to biodesign. Get on? Okay, sure. I'm a recorder. Yep. All right, everyone. So let's get started. So for the rest of my presentation, what we're going to go through is the 4 different parts of the need statement, right? So we're going to talk about a little bit about the strategy of how to think about it. We've already alluded to some important stuff that you need to be thinking about, which is, for example, scoping. So thinking about the scope of the problem you're working on. Do you want to increase the scope, decrease the scope? Do you want to go to parallel scope? So just sort of having that framework in your head and actually doing it when you're doing it live is really, really important. So let's focus on the problem. Now my images don't load. Let's see if I can reload that. Yeah, already have. Cool. So this is the problem, like I said before, from the user's perspective, okay? And so implicit, honestly, in the problem is, do you know which user you're talking about as well, right? And part of the sort of challenge of this is, in a lot of contexts, who you think might be the user actually might be completely different, particularly in a low-income setting, right? So a sort of classic example of this is, when we think of cataract surgeries, the vast majority of us think of ophthalmologists, right? Ophthalmologist, the eye surgeon, right? But in low-income countries, does anyone actually know how cataract surgeries are done? Any ideas? No. Good thinking, right? Any other ideas? So there are actually these people called cataract surgeons who all they do are cataract surgeries. So they're actually not physicians, they're not doctors, they're not surgeons. They are merely cataract surgeons. So they're literally just people who have undergone like a boot camp for 3 months. They know how to do cataract surgeries, and all they go around doing is cataract surgeries. Okay? So you see how the user is completely different, right? That's why you really have to challenge any assumptions you might have about whatever problem you're solving, because whatever problem is, actually happening on the ground, it might be completely different people who you're used to, right? Who's actually dealing with the problem. And so you really have to dig in, figure out, is it, for example, a specific type of surgeon that isn't even a surgeon or a general surgeon or a physician even, right? They're just trained to do something very specific. Is it someone else like nursing? Is it someone else like the patient's family, right? There's a lot of stuff that honestly is completely different to how we see it. And so you really have to challenge that. The user is generally someone who has direct exposure to the problem, right? And will ideally administer the solution, right? Sometimes there's a bit of controversy on who the user actually is. Is it, for example, in this case, if it's a case with two specialties, is it a cardiologist who deals with the problem? Is it cardiothoracics, for example, the surgeon who deals with it? Is it the GP? So there's lots of sometimes controversy of it. And sometimes you do see areas where there are turf wars, right? So particularly valuable clinical areas. Generally there's this thing called turf wars, which is, for example, a radiologist might want to do that, but a cardiologist might also want to do that, right? And so they actually fight who does it and who captures that value. And so you might see yourself sort of in those turf wars. If you're a bit unsure, where you can, please err on the side of closer to frontline, okay? So that is the user is someone who directly interfaces with the patient, okay? So that is whether they're directly responsible for their care or they're someone who actually directly deals with the patient, literally, right? Like every day, right? And you'll see this quite often, but doctors aren't as involved to the front line as you might think, right? Sometimes it's actually nursing staff who might be really actually with the patient most of the time, right? And so they'll know a lot of the issues that come up, while doctors might know it theoretically, but not really what's happening to the patient, okay? So our recommendation is, again, make sure that you first-hand interview someone who's close to the front line and honestly spends a lot of their time dealing with the patient's issues. Now, in terms of where we generally lie, clinicians are often great at generating needs, so I don't expect you to sort of have issues with brainstorming reasons why something's failing. However, clinicians are often subject to blind spots, and I've noticed that this is correlated to how much experience that clinician has in a certain field, right? So if you, for example, ask, say you're doing some cardiology thing, if you're speaking to a cardiologist who has spent, most of their career in that field, right? They generally sort of have blind spots to things that could be done better, right? So they'll have maybe it's a better device that they want or something, but they're sort of really blind to a completely new way of doing something, right? So a sort of classic story of this, which I think I talk about in a later slide, is oncologists, right? So there was a group at Stanford and I think in Hong Kong that were looking to create a blood test that could detect cancer, right? So I'm sure you've heard of it, it's called liquid biopsy, right? It's a new sort of technology that's coming up over the last few years. And when they spoke to a lot of experienced oncologists, they couldn't fathom sort of this investigation, right? Because the paradigm that they had been trained in to sort of work in over decades was, you get cancer and then you treat it rather than trying to detect that cancer before it becomes serious. Does that make sense? So it's sort of a paradigm shift. And so I found that experts, are great for sort of what's happening right now, what could be incrementally improved, but they aren't great for paradigm shifts, right? Which is whole new ways of thinking, just because their training doesn't really rely on it. Clinicians also seem to be worse at unearthing unique insights. And so, when you have an engineer sort of sit down and talk with you about an unmet clinical need or someone who's sort of fresh to the field, often they'll ask questions like, why aren't you just doing that instead? Or why aren't you doing this, right? Like it's pretty obvious to someone who isn't trained in oncology that you should be detecting the cancer way before it becomes stage 3 or stage 4, right? But to oncologists, just because, again, their frame of mind is that, they often might miss that, right? And so having sort of that fresh perspective, right, and maybe even talking to your friends or family members or whatever about the things that you're working on, they might just ask an important question that you might have missed, just because you have that clinical training now, right, or starting to have that clinical training. And so the way that you think is being shaped in a certain way. Now the fix to this is to always bring a beginner's mindset, and what I mean by that is be okay with not knowing why things happen a certain way and honestly just asking about it, right? So, be very much like the first day of med school, right, where you sort of don't know what's happening and actually ask people, why are they doing it this way? If you see sort of like an unusual fix that they're using for a certain problem in hospital or on the ground, ask them why. Why are they doing that, right? Is there a reason why they're doing it in that specific way? And I'm sure, these are all very rational people. They'll have a reason behind it, and you want to understand that reason, okay? Keep digging deeper. And so ask why a lot, even if you think you know the answer. So the worst thing actually is when clinicians think they know the answer to why there is a problem on the ground, right? Usually it means that you can't sort of unearth unique insights, and assumptions are indeed the worst error for innovators. All right, and that's the cancer test, so please feel free to look it up. That's actually the cancer test that has come out, right, called Galeri. Just got acquired as well, so it's quite a financial success. But this was the blood test that sort of challenged our notion of how we treat cancer. And so we actually tried to shift cancer treatment to much earlier in the disease phase, right? We're trying to detect it at much earlier stages, and therefore, as you can imagine, mortality really rapidly goes down if we're treating it at stage 1, stage 2, rather than stage 3 and stage 4. Okay, now recall your goal will be to generate sort of tens or hundreds of needs sort of in these upcoming days. And so there's a lot of strategies that you can use. Obviously one is, one that we've mentioned now, which is dig deeper and ask stupid questions, sort of just ask lots of questions or try and figure out why, read into why, sort of be the team that spends a lot more time figuring out sort of the unique insights and figuring out why things work the way they do. Now other techniques as well is stuff called scoping exercises, and this generally encompasses problem scoping, journey scoping, and user scoping, so we'll cover what those mean. So problem scoping, generally the sort of trick that people use is to actually just draw a tree, right? And so say you have a problem that you've identified, say reduce falls from poor vision, you can actually make the problem that you're working on a lot more specific, right? So if you move up the tree or towards one of the branches, right? One way that you can sort of deal with reducing falls from poor vision is to target cataracts specifically. Okay, so cataracts is a cause of poor vision. You can also move back down the tree, so towards the trunk of the tree, in which case we're dealing with a much broader problem. So instead of reducing falls specifically from poor vision, we're now just reducing falls. Okay? So you see how this is a very useful exercise for us to understand, should you be digging deeper into a smaller but more specific problem, or are you trying to tackle a much broader problem? Okay? And getting the scoping level on your problems is absolutely critical, right? Because as you can imagine, the solutions for reducing falls in general is going to be very different to the solutions from reducing falls from cataracts specifically, right? So the set of solutions that you're going to explore are vastly, vastly different, okay? And then at the same time, it's worthwhile asking, if we're operating on poor vision, should we operate on something that's parallel? So for example, age-related macular degeneration, right? So you can sort of experience sort of different scopes and see what feels right, okay? And this is actually where some of that innovation experience comes from, which is knowing which is the right level of scope to target, okay? So this is sort of a general form of the problem scoping, right? So you have your initial problem, just try it on for size, right? It's a bit of a Goldilocks problem, so it's like, hey, what does it look like if we have a broader problem? What does it look like if we try this narrower problem, right? Does it feel right? And what does it feel like if we have this parallel problem, okay? So again, just more permutations, right? When you have a need statement, just try this exercise and see if you should be targeting narrower, parallel, or broader. Okay, so journey scoping. So journey scoping is when you actually map out the clinical workflow, okay? So in this case here, we have, for example, patient develops a visual issue, right? The visual issue worsens over time, the patient falls, the patient's admitted to the hospital, and the patient is discharged, right? So if, for example, we're dealing with prevention of falls, then would work right here, right, in the clinical workflow. But a big question is, should we go even earlier? Should we go later, right? So mapping out the clinical workflow is a very useful exercise because it allows you to sort of think about the clinical workflow and where you should be acting earlier or later and where the problem really lies, okay? So again, just different ways to sort of stimulate your brain on how to figure out the problem. User scoping. So in user scoping, the questions you need to ask is who else is involved in the patient's care? Okay, what other stakeholders have you not considered, right? Can someone else be empowered? You know, so for example, we talked about the anesthetic registrar before. Could it, for example, be someone brought up the nurse practitioner, right, who could be involved in intubation, right? Someone who's just trained to do intubations constantly, right? And so they get really good at it. And in low-income countries in particular, there's this giant concept called task shifting, which is the rational redistribution of tasks, generally to someone who's less trained. Okay, so it's like that cataract surgeon idea, right? We don't need a fully fledged ophthalmologist for cataract surgeries. We just need someone who's really good at cataract surgeries, and they do thousands and thousands of them, and they get really, really good at cataract surgeries, right? You don't need the whole spectrum of someone trained in ophthalmology, okay? So task shifting is a very important sort of concept in low-income countries, and so they're a lot more open-minded to this, okay? You know, and it's something to think about even for Australia, right? Do we need people who are completely trained in the whole spectrum of a disease in order to be really good at something, right? Because what's happening now anyway is that we're getting sub-specialization, right? In a lot of specialties, we're getting people who are getting really good at very specific things, right? They've had that whole training and then get sort of really specific. And so we're sort of shifting towards that rational redistribution, but in a different way. The things you should be thinking about in terms of different people are the following. So first is, what is the training level that you need for them, right? What is the specialty you're dealing with? Do they have specific clinical interests? What kind of facility should they be working in? You know, can you, for example, shift something that's in a major hospital out to the community? Does it have to be in a hospital, right? Does it have to be even in a clinic? Can it be at home, right? So that's sort of where you need to think about when you're looking at problems. Can you, for example, shift it to carers and family, right? And actually take the burden off the healthcare system. Are there any specific demographic or socioeconomic focuses that you can look at for different problems as well, okay? For example, could you be looking at, you know, problems that are present in marginalized populations or populations which are much lower socioeconomic? So just again, things to think about when you use the scoping. All right, so that is the problem. The second part of the need statement is the population, okay? So this is the population with the specific unmet clinical need. And it almost always is a patient population of some sort, all right? Now I say almost always just because some solutions are targeted towards doctors, okay? So sometimes you're solving a specific issue for doctors, okay? In which case the population would be, for example, a population of clinicians. Now we are usually pretty good at figuring out the basic population. Okay, so we sort of have an idea, like that anesthetic registrar one. We know that it's a patient who could be undergoing surgery, could be a patient in the ED, right? So we sort of have a good idea of that. But once we have the basic population, like I said before, we need to do a bit of population scoping, which is figuring out the specific segment of the population we're going to target, right? So, you know, we, for example, talked about Sudanese children. It's unlikely our solution, right, will target all Sudanese children. That's like a very high ask. It's sort of saying you'll target all Australian children, right? And so the specific segment that you actually want to focus on, these are actually really difficult to know unless you're working with that population day to day, right? It's really difficult for you to know what the different segments are, right? It could be age specific, it could be gender specific, it could be all sorts of stuff, right? And so that's where you actually need to draw some unique insights from those at the front line, right? Because only those who sort of are constantly exposed to this population can figure out what the archetypes are, right? What the different segments are, what the different groups are, what the different types of patients are, right? And so as you can imagine, you know, if we're dealing with say, I don't know, like a group of MS patients or something, you really want to talk to someone who's dealing with MS patients day in and day out, right? Because that's when they know what the archetypes are. It could be like a patient with these habits, could be a patient with these sort of set of interests, or something that's causing issues, right? If you're unsure, it is better to err on the side of a more specific population, okay? So this is related to scoping, but generally when you're scoping, you should be conservative, right? That is, you should be focusing on smaller populations rather than bigger, okay? So if, for example, you're unsure between Sudanese children versus Sudanese children in this community, err for the smaller one, right? Because it's a safer bet, right? It's unlikely you're going to tackle the entire population, okay? All right, so strategies for population scoping, right? The sort of things that you should be thinking about is things like geography, right? So we're going to get you actually to focus on specific country, probably even a specific community, to be completely honest with you, right? It's unlikely going to solve a problem for the entire country, right, of whatever million people. Think about specific demographics, so it could be different age ranges, different genders, right? So these shouldn't be arbitrary, it should be sort of grounded, for example, in the medicine itself, right? Or like insights that you're getting from interviews, right? So for example, we talked about malnutrition. We just know for a fact that how you treat malnutrition is different between less than 1 to 4 plus, right? And so that's an important distinction. But you know, if you're dealing with another problem and there's no such split, then you wouldn't consider age, okay? So you have to be able to justify why you're scoping the population. Think about socioeconomic and marginalization status. Think about specific clinical risk factors. So are there patients with specific symptoms you want to treat? Is it specific comorbidities you want to treat? Is it specific severity levels? Attitude towards healthcare providers. So lots of countries have issues with, or sort of historical issues with healthcare systems in their own country, right? So for example, a distrust of their healthcare system. So think about if that's something you want to combine in. Any existing treatments they've received before, and access to technology in healthcare, okay? So these are things you have to think about. You know, does this population have access to the internet? Does this population have access to mobile phones, right? Does this population sort of have access to things that you can leverage? All right, so population scoping, again, very similar, okay? So you have the initial population, you just do an exercise where you consider the broader population, a narrower population, and then a parallel population. So an example would be this, so malnourished children in Malawi, malnourished children in this specific region of Malawi, malnourished children in general, right? And then malnourished children in Syria, okay? So just think about the different scopes of the population. All right, so the final two are the outcome and the payer. I've done the payer first just because it's important for you to think about the payer first. So this is where it starts to get extremely challenging, and actually probably the primary reason why a lot of global health tech fails, right? Which is people haven't carefully considered the payer. And so we're gonna force you to think about it from the get-go, right? And so payers are extremely heterogeneous in low-income countries. So for example, if you figure out the payers for a specific region in Malawi, probably in a different region, it's a different set of payers, right? It's just a different financial set of circumstances on the ground. So it's both per region and per condition, right? And so these are the different options that people primarily have when it comes to paying healthcare in low and low middle income countries. So the first is out of pocket. As you can imagine, a lot of people actually have to pay out of pocket to pay for a device or a drug or whatever, but the funds that they have generally are extremely limited. Okay, so it's usually, maybe if you can figure it out, like there's a chance that it can be a viable funding strategy, but usually it's very, very challenging, right? Because if you build a device, and even if it costs like $10 or $15, it might be way too much for someone to be spending on healthcare, right? The second is government funding. Usually this is not great. As you can imagine, these low-income countries, they don't spend a lot on healthcare, right? And their budgets aren't huge. And whatever device you create they're not willing to sort of suck it out of their budget, right? To run the rest of their hospitals, okay? So again, not great. Donor funding, international aid, and non-government organizations. So we'll have a whole sort of lecture on the different ones here. Again, these have a lot of money, but the problem is their priorities can be very fickle. Okay, they can sort of change on a whim, but a lot of companies do rely on that. Okay, so that is sort of an avenue. You have to think carefully about what their priorities are. Some communities in very rare places have insurance schemes that they've managed to set up, right? So there's all sorts of insurance schemes that you can sort of figure out. Sometimes people just pull funds together. Sometimes it's some sort of community resource that they can tax, right? But yeah, insurance schemes sometimes exist. And then people have also come up with all sorts of innovative funding vehicles. Unclear if they'll succeed, right? It's sort of in the area where we're still experimenting a little bit with them, right? So, you know, time will tell in about 5 to 10 years as to whether these work or not. All right, the outcome. So the outcome is a quantifiable metric that is compelling to the payer. So once you figure out who the payer is, you have to ask them, what is it they're measuring their success on? Okay, and do you move the needle enough, okay, for them to pay? So quantifiable here means that it's an outcome that can be measured and tracked, okay? So very clear, it has to be something that they can measure. Okay, they have literally someone on the ground measuring the success, okay? They can track it, they can report back to their superiors and say that they're doing great, okay? And compelling means that it's highly visible, so that is, you know, everyone's a hero if you can solve this, and it's widely accepted. So there's no controversy on whether improving these numbers means that the company has succeeded. Does that make sense? So this obviously requires you to understand the payer very well, right? If the payer is the patient themselves, then you have to ask, what does the patient or carer actually want? Okay, so for example, some people want to reduce pain. They want to do so that they can improve their lifestyle, or they can do more sports, or they can go out for walks with their grandchildren, or whatever it is, right? So that's what they actually want. The government, usually governments have some sort of key performance indicators, okay, KPIs, which is a metric of how successful their Department of Health is, basically, right? And so you can take a look at those KPIs and see if anyone actually cares about them, okay? And then NGOs, this usually is aligned to their mission, and they'll have a number of metrics, usually that they'll publish, okay? So in modern times, a lot of NGOs now publish what they're actually doing, right? And so you sort of really want to understand what their metrics are, what their mission is, whether those metrics are likely to change in any way, okay? And you want to make sure that your product is aligned with that. And the acid test, honestly, is to simply ask the payer. So if any of the teams are identifying a payer that's absolutely critical, so say for example, it's like the World Health Organization or whatever it is, we're probably going to get you to actually reach out to these people and ask them, if you create something, will it be something they're willing to pay for, right? And so that's actually the only honest way for you to figure out if it's something they'll pay for. And you want to find that out nice and early. You don't want to find it out like after 2 years of spending your effort on this project and then realizing no one will pay for it. All right, common pitfalls for the need statement. So these are things that we're going to sort of keep an eye out for. So please keep an eye out for it yourself as well. So if one sort of pitfall that we often see is stating a solution in the problem itself. So take a look at that need statement there. A way to develop an antithrombotic coronary stent for. So you see how we've defined a solution in the problem, okay? So this is a big no-no, and the primary reason why is that it both constrains the needs and the solution space, because it does assume now that we're going to create an antithrombotic coronary stent, okay? So avoid stating the solution in your need statement, okay? So make sure that you avoid doing that. Sometimes another pitfall is stating the need in the outcome, okay? So a way to reduce falls in the elderly to reduce falls. Okay, so you see how it's a bit of a circular argument, right? A way to reduce falls, right? Usually what this means is that you don't understand the perspective either of the user or of the payer, because generally their incentives aren't aligned. Okay, very rarely are they aligned. Now in some cases, the user might actually be the payer. So for example, in some problems, you might actually realize that the patient themselves has to pay, right? In which case the payer and the user will be the same. However, what that generally means is that you're mixing up the clinical need. So the clinical need, for example, could be reducing pain, right? With the broader life need. So the patient wants to reduce pain so that they can do more exercise, or they can spend time with their grandchildren without it hurting. So you see how there's sort of a broad life need and then the clinical need, okay? Other pitfalls. So the need is stuck in current practice, okay? So for example, a way to improve the speed of fax machines, right? This is obviously a sort of silly sounding example, but you see how it assumes that there has to be a fax machine present in the solution. Okay? So again, sort of a similar pitfall to be aware of. And then the final pitfall is that the need relies on a negative. So a way to not have infections from dialysis, so this not here. And the reason why we don't like this is that it also reduces or restricts the solution space. Okay? So these are just sort of common pitfalls. There's lots of other criteria or feedback that we'll give for need statements, but these are generally considered sort of bad practice to put in your need statements. All right, needs finding. So, we've discussed this before, but the purpose of generating so many different needs is so that you can effectively explore the need space, okay? And sort of map out the landscape of what the unmet needs look like. And so it is reliant on 3 activities that we're going to get you to do. The first to be background research, okay? And we'll tell you actually what to research. The second is observation. Now, unfortunately, we can't get you sort of on the ground in these countries, but we'll try our best to sort of give you an idea of what healthcare looks like, right? And then the third is validation interviews, which we're going to rely very heavily on. So that is getting you guys to talk to people on the ground to figure out more about the problem and more about what solutions might work, okay? So, background research. These are the questions you need to ask, so feel free to take a picture of this, right? So there are 4 main categories you need to cover when looking at an unmet need. The first is understanding the disease state itself, okay? So for example, if you're interested in malnutrition, you really need to understand how malnutrition works, what the sort of clinical aspects of it are. So that sort of stuff, all the stuff that you learn in med school is going to be very useful for you to get a feel for disease state fundamentals. The second is existing solutions, okay? So what do people use right now to solve it, right? So malnutrition, you might find out, dig a bit deeper, find out that, for example, breastfeeding is very critical to avoid malnutrition, right? So what are the existing solutions that people are using now? Are they, for example, using, sort of other solutions to breastfeeding when they cannot breastfeed, right? Like what other existing solutions on the market? The third is stakeholder analysis. So who is actually involved in the care of the patient? Who is making the decisions, right? Who is actually involved in all that stuff? Then the final thing is market analysis. So what's the rough market size? And is there someone who's willing to fund, okay? And part of the problem why this is important, right? So even though you might not be doing something commercial, obviously if you're solving a bigger problem, donors will be much more interested, right? If you're solving a problem that's very sort of thin, then donors might be less interested, right? But so these are the 4 sort of things you need to be asking. Okay, at the late stage, and again, you can take a picture of these. These are the sort of questions that you need to ask. Again, it's the 4 same topics, but these are a little bit more advanced in terms of what you need to ask. Okay, so that's background research. Now, observation. So, with observation, historically, most biodesign classes, you have to actually go to the community and observe as much as you can, but obviously just because of financial resources, we can't send you all to different countries, right? But the goal of observation is to gain unique insights for recurring situations, okay? So if you're seeing a common motif sort of come up every time you observe something, right, or so most of the time, right, that usually indicates that there's some sort of issue there. Does that make sense? So it's not really a once-off or something that you might hear about once and you never hear about again. You're sort of looking for recurrence, okay? Now obviously this is very difficult to do remotely, right? But what you want to do is try and paint a picture in your interviews. So when you're talking to people on the ground, right? Ask them actually to describe, for example, like vividly what procedure they're doing or what is actually happening when they're talking to a patient and something comes up, right? So try to ask more, I guess, for them to show you something rather than just tell you, okay? Because you're trying to get a vivid picture of what is actually happening on the ground. Now you can also reach out to friends who might be on the ground. So I think some of you might know people who are going through team med or might have connections to different countries, right? See if you can find sort of connections to people on the ground. See what you can find online, right? So a lot of people have access to YouTube now. People post stuff about what's happening in their country, right? See if you can find stuff that actually allows you to observe what's happening. And then finally, make sure and see if you can find a clinician on the ground who is happy to help you, right? Because that is a very sort of powerful connect for you to that community. Now, some clues that you might actually look for is sort of these different clues here. So from a patient perspective, if the patient is stressed, inconvenienced in some way, they've undergone a clinical complication, generally that indicates some sort of unmet need, okay? From a clinician side, if something has malfunctioned, which is very common in a low-income setting, that usually indicates some sort of need. If they're unsure or indecisive, it indicates some sort of need as well. If they've made a high-risk decision, okay, so a decision that you deem to be high risk, right, for the reasons that you can't explain, then that generally indicates a need. And if someone refers to a dogma, that is, how it's always been done, generally that also indicates an area of need as well, okay? From the system side, what you're looking for is waste or inefficiency. So for example, extra staff or extra beds required or whatever it is, right? Poor information transfer or handovers, and then things that lead to high costs, okay? So if, for example, you're speaking to an executive of a hospital, right? Ask them what are their biggest headaches from a cost perspective, right? And generally that indicates areas of unmet need. All right, the final tool that you have are interviews. And this is what we're going to be relying on primarily. So interviews are a targeted method to find new needs and explore/refine your understanding of the need space. And so we're going to actually cover a bit more about how to do interviews tomorrow. We'll get you to practice some as well because it's a bit of an art form that you need to practice and get good at. But these are some sort of general tips. The first is when you're doing an interview, please be clear with your priorities, right? So generally, when we get this team here to do interviews, right, we'll have like 1 or 2 key priorities that we want from this interview. Does that make sense? You sort of have to have a clear idea of what you're trying to get out of the person you're interviewing. Make sure to interview at least in pairs, right? Preferably with the whole team, where one person asks questions and then one takes notes, okay? Seek a broad range of perspectives, so don't go straight for the experts. Like I said, the experts are great for what's happening on the ground, incremental improvements, that sort of stuff, right? But non-experts aren't trained, in terms of how everything works. And so they might actually come up with better ideas about how to do things, right? Because they don't sort of have those barriers. And after the interview, always have a hot debrief, which is you talk as a team about the takeaways, how to refine any need statements or anything you're working on, and then what the actions for the next steps are. All right, you can take a picture of these questions. But basically, these are strategies to have effective interview questions, okay? And we'll cover it a bit more tomorrow on how to actually ask effective interview questions. All right. So, too fast? Let me go back. Yeah. All right, perfect. Now, when you're crafting questions, please be culturally sensitive, okay? One way to do so is actually to reach out to someone based at Monash who has connections into that community, okay? Because they'll have an idea of how to be asking culturally sensitive questions, okay? Because they can sort of interlocute between our culture and their culture. And where possible, please use lay language, okay? So I think medical students and doctors in particular can be a little bit direct with their clinical questions, right? So just things like, instead of do you have fecal incontinence, have you had any bathroom related accidents, okay? So sort of speak the language of patients, speak the language of, doctors who might not be sort of, using this terminology, or tell me more about your illness or disease, tell me more about what you're experiencing, okay? So just sort of be mindful of how you're framing your questions because the language that you might use with your clinical colleagues is very different to how, lots of other people operate. Okay, so after you have tens or hundreds of potential unmet needs, you need to go through a process called need screening, okay? So how screening itself works is it's a rigorous and structured process to evaluate and identify the most promising need to work on. And the basic principle is that you sort of need to have a competitive process, okay? That is, you have, say, hundreds of needs, and you actually get them to compete against each other to see which one is the best. And so it's relatively simple. So there is early stage screening and then late stage screening. So early stage meaning, for example, around 200 needs down to 75, when you sort of need to do something really quick, right? Only takes you an hour rather than sort of 8 hours, right? Step 1 is to select your screening criteria. So keep these criteria really simple. It could be like, does it sound like a real need to the team? Is the market biggish? Is the team interested, right? and you just sort of go together as a team and you go yes or no, right? You basically score every need statement that you have, you add it together, and then you basically just pick the best ones. Okay? Very simple. Late stage screening, so this is when you have, say, 15, you need to get it down to the top 5 or 10, right? This is where you sort of need to put in a lot of effort to figure out which one is best. So again, select your screening criteria. You need to be a bit more careful with how you do this. So this is a very sort of classic one that people use. Patient impact, say 2x weight, treatment landscape, reduction in overall costs, positive impact to a large population. So you want to sort of figure out criteria that are important to your team. Okay, and you can discuss this is still very flexible. And then you create a table of what it actually means. So for example, patient impact could be addressing the need would be life-saving to patients. So that would be like the max score. The lower score would be, addressing the need would not have a significant impact. For treatment landscape, the highest score would be there's nothing there. There's no existing treatments. Everyone's sort of just screwed right now, right? Versus there are treatments which exist and they're generally well accepted. Reduction in overall costs, maybe there's, if you really want to save costs, then there's major cost savings up here, and there's something that actually increases costs down here. Okay, and then positive impact to large population, maybe you want a problem as a team that impacts more than 1 million people, okay? Versus something that affects fewer than 10,000 people. So again, this just sort of reflects what your team thinks is important, okay? And sort of, you need to have a discussion as a team, like we want to work on problems that look like this or look like this, okay? Right, for each you assign a score, and then you sort of just select the best ones. And then, essentially you just, once you reach I think the top 5 or 10, you just sort of decide as a team which one you might want to work on, okay? Because the top 5, ideally they're all really good problems to work on, and you sort of want to just figure out which one you want to do. So at the early stages, move quickly and rely on intuition. Later stages, rely primarily on your data. If you need to, then schedule fresh interviews to figure out questions that might come from this process, okay? And then less than 10, you want to just make sure, sanity check that your needs are actually solid and robust, okay? So you can just reach out to different experts. And then selecting top 1 is completely up to the team, right? And we're not going to sort of pressure you to go one way or the other, just like whatever you think is most appropriate. Okay, screening criteria. So there's lots of ways to construct the criteria, but generally they will involve something about the disease state fundamentals, the existing solutions, so what actually exists on the market right now, who it impacts, and then the market size. And then subjective stuff that you might consider as well is how much you actually like this project, right? We don't want you to be working on a project you don't like. How much it fits with your strategic focus. So maybe, it's your life's passion to work on women's health, right? Then you obviously might want to do something in women's health. Life compatibility, and if it's blue sky versus incremental. Okay, so is it something that you're creating from scratch, or are you sort of incrementally improving something? Okay, that's actually it from a biodesign perspective. So any questions before I hand over to these guys here? Okay, cool.